The man who could destroy a $1 billion empire was changing oil filters in a two-bay garage. Nolan Pierce knew exactly which batch of engines would fail. He'd known for 10 years. And tonight, the woman whose company built those engines was parking outside his shop with questions he'd spent a decade preparing to answer. But before we see how one mechanic's filing cabinet brought down an automotive giant, let me ask you this. Have you ever been the only person who knew the truth? Stay until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The fluorescent lights in Pierce Auto Repair flickered the way they always did around 7 p.m. 3 steady pulses, then a buzz that settled into the ambient hum of a Thursday evening in Grayford, Ohio. Nolan Pierce didn't look up from the Chevy Malibu he was working on. The flicker was just another rhythm in the mechanical symphony he'd learned to live inside. The pneumatic hiss of the lift, the tick of cooling metal, the distant bark of Mrs. Chen's terrier 3 properties down. He wiped his hands on a rag that had been gray since 2019 and checked his watch. 7:14. Elsie's mac and cheese was in the oven at home, timer set for 7:45. He had time to finish this oil change and maybe get a look at the transmission that had been making that grinding noise in third gear. The bell above the door chimed. Nolan glanced over his shoulder, expecting Mrs. Patterson coming to ask again about her Honda's squeaky brakes, the one she refused to let him actually fix because her cousin's boyfriend said it was probably just dust. It wasn't Mrs. Patterson. The woman in the doorway wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Nolan's mortgage payment. Her dark hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she paid someone to make it look that effortless. She was young, early 30s maybe, but she carried herself with the kind of rigid posture that came from too many boardrooms and not enough sleep. Nolan knew who she was before she said a word. He'd seen her face in trade publications, on business news segments he caught while Elsie watched cartoons in the other room. Marin Vale, CEO of Vale Automotive Systems. 30 years old and running a company her grandfather had built from a tool and die shop in Detroit 70 years ago. She was also, if the rumors were true, about 6 weeks away from watching that empire collapse into bankruptcy and federal investigation. "We're closing up," Nolan said, turning back to the Malibu. "You can leave your keys in the drop box. I'll look at it tomorrow." "I'm not here to leave my car." Her voice was clipped, northeastern, expensive. "You're Nolan Pierce. Sign says so on the building. I need to talk to you." Nolan drained the last of the old oil into the pan and reached for the filter wrench. "Phone's on the wall. Office hours are Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. You want an appointment, call Sharon. She handles the schedule." "Sharon is your answering machine." "Sharon's very efficient." Marinvale didn't move from the doorway. Nolan could feel her watching him work, cataloging, calculating. He'd seen that look before, back when he wore a different kind of clothes and worked in a different kind of building. "Mr. Pierce, I'm not here about your services as a mechanic. Only service I offer." "I know who you are." Nolan's hands paused for half a second, then continued unscrewing the filter. Oil dripped dark and thick into the catch pan. "Congratulations. You want a medal? I know you worked for us 12 years ago. I know you were part of the R&D team that developed the VX7 engine platform. That was a long time ago. I know you left the company in 2015. I know you filed 3 separate internal reports about a defect in the cylinder head assembly. And I know—" She took a step into the garage, her heels clicking on the concrete. "I know you've been repairing VX7 engines in this garage for the past decade." Nolan set down the wrench and finally looked at her directly. "You drove 3 hours from Detroit to tell me things you already know?" "I drove 3 hours to ask if you kept records." The fluorescent lights flickered again. Somewhere in the back office, the space heater kicked on with a rattle that Nolan kept meaning to fix. "Records of what?" "Don't insult both of us, Mr. Pierce." Marin's jaw was tight. 743 VX7 engines have catastrophically failed in the past 18 months. The NHTSA opened an investigation in January. We've recalled every vehicle. Our stock price has dropped 62% in 3 weeks. And every single failure matches the exact defect pattern you reported in 2015. Nolan pulled a fresh filter from the shelf and began threading it onto the Malibu's engine block. Sounds like you have a problem. We have lawsuits in 11 states. We have a federal investigation. We have families who lost loved ones in crashes caused by engines that seized at highway speeds. Her voice cracked slightly on the last part, just a hairline fracture in the professional veneer. And we have lawyers who found your name buried in old company records, the man who warned us this would happen. Then you don't need me. You already know what went wrong. I need to know what you know. I need to know what you documented. Because right now, the picture being painted is that Vail Automotive deliberately ignored safety warnings and continued production, that we knew about the defect and hid it. Nolan lowered the Malibu off the lift and wiped his hands again. Did you? No. But someone did. Marin's silence was its own answer. Nolan walked to the small office at the back of the garage, barely more than a closet with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a calendar from a parts supplier that was 3 years out of date. Elsie's drawing of a purple dinosaur was taped to the wall, the corners curling. He could feel Marin following him, her presence filling the small space like a pressure change before a storm. He unlocked the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. Inside were folders, dozens of them, organized by year, by batch code, by failure type, each one meticulously labeled in Nolan's precise engineer's handwriting. 2015, he said, pulling out a thick folder. First batch of VX7s that came through here. Guy brought in a Traverse, engine seized on I-75. Towed it in, told me it just died. No warning. I pulled the engine apart and found the cylinder head cracked along the same stress line I'd flagged in the design phase. He opened the folder. Inside were photos, printed on regular copy paper, close-ups of metal fractures, measuring tools placed for scale, batch codes stamped into engine blocks. Took photos, documented everything, called it a fluke. He pulled out another folder. 2016, 3 more engines, same failure, same crack pattern, same batch code series. Another folder. 2017, 7 engines. 2018, 14. 2019, 22. The folders stacked up on the desk between them, a growing paper monument to a decade of systematic failure. I kept calling it flukes, Nolan said quietly. Kept thinking maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'd missed something in the original design, made a mistake in the calculations, so I kept fixing them. Kept documenting. Kept waiting for someone at your company to notice the pattern. Marin was staring at the folders like they were evidence at a crime scene. How many total? Through last month? 217 engines, all failures consistent with the defect I reported in 2015. All failures I documented with photos, batch codes, customer statements, and repair notes. Why didn't you come forward? Why didn't you contact someone? Nolan almost laughed. I did come forward 3 times, filed internal reports with engineering, with safety, with your executive team. You know what happened? I got called paranoid. Got told I was seeing patterns that weren't there. Got told the design had been triple-checked and approved by everyone who mattered. He closed the filing cabinet drawer with his boot. Then I got fired for performance issues. Escorted out of the building by security. Had to sign an NDA that said, if I ever talked about proprietary company information, you'd sue me for everything I'd ever own. Who fired you? Your head of operations? Guy named Conrad Sloan. Something shifted in Marin's expression, a muscle tightening in her jaw, a flicker of recognition that she tried to suppress. But Nolan had been reading people's faces across counters and under hoods for a decade. He caught it. You know him, Nolan said. It wasn't a question. He's been with the company for 30 years. He was my grandfather's right hand. He's also the one who buried my reports and pushed the VX7 into production 6 months ahead of schedule. Nolan tapped the folders. I can prove it. Every engine I documented came from batches manufactured in that accelerated timeline, the ones your company rushed out to meet a contract deadline. Marin reached for the top folder, then stopped. Can I? Nolan nodded. She opened it carefully, like it might explode. Her eyes scanned the photos, the notes written in Nolan's tight engineering script. Date, March 14th, 2015. Vehicle, 2014. Chevy Traverse. Mileage, 47,382. Failure. Complete seizure. I-75 northbound, 68 miles per hour. Customer reported no warning lights, no performance issues prior to failure. Engine disassembly reveals. This is exactly what we're seeing now, Marin said. These cracks. This failure sequence. It's identical to the NHTSA reports. Because it's the same defect. Same metallurgy problem in the cylinder head casting. I told your engineers the alloy mixture wasn't heat treating properly. The crystal structure was developing microfractures during the curing process. Under sustained high heat conditions, highway driving, towing, anything that really pushed the engine, those microfractures would propagate until catastrophic failure. Marin looked up from the folder. You remember all of this? The technical details? I designed that engine, Ms. Vale. I spent 2 years of my life on the VX7 platform. I knew every alloy composition, every tolerance spec, every thermal load calculation. Nolan leaned against the filing cabinet. I also knew it wasn't ready for production when Sloan pushed it through, but I was 28 years old, and he was the guy who'd built half the cars in America. So when he said I was wrong, I figured maybe I was. Until the engines started failing. Until the engines started failing, Nolan agreed. And by then, I was here, raising a kid, running a shop, fixing the problem over and over again because it's what I know how to do. Marin closed the folder and looked around the small office, at the purple dinosaur drawing, at the space heater with its rattling fan, at the man in front of her who'd spent 10 years quietly documenting the collapse of her company's flagship product. What do you want? She asked. Want? For these records. For your testimony. There are lawyers who would pay you a significant amount of money for what's in these folders. Nolan checked his watch. 7:31. Elsie's mac and cheese had 14 minutes left. I don't want your money. Then what? He met her eyes. I want you to tell me the truth. Did you know about the defect? No. The answer came fast, definitive. I took over as CEO 2 years ago when my father stepped down. The VX7 was already in production, already in millions of vehicles. I knew we were having quality issues, but Conrad kept telling me it was normal variation, acceptable failure rates, cost of doing business. And you believed him. I believed the data he showed me. I believed the engineers he put in front of the board. I believed... She stopped. I believed the company my grandfather built wouldn't put profit over safety. Nolan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your grandfather was a good man. Hired me right out of MIT, gave me a chance to work on real projects. He cared about building things that lasted. He died 8 years ago. I know, came to the funeral. Nolan smiled slightly, stood in the back. Didn't think anyone would remember the kid from R&D. Conrad spoke at the service, talked about legacy and standards and everything my grandfather built. Marin's voice was hollow. 3 months later, he was pushing the VX7 into production over your objections. The space heater rattled. The fluorescent lights flickered. These records, Nolan said, gesturing to the folders. They're not going to save your company. You know that, right? This much documentation, this clear a pattern of ignored warnings. Whoever's responsible is going to face criminal charges. There are people dead because of this defect. I know. So why are you here? Why not just let your lawyers subpoena me? Let this all come out in court. Marin was quiet for the long moment. Then she said, Because I want to know the whole truth before it comes out in pieces. Because I want to understand what happened to the company my family built. And because, she looked directly at him, because I read your personnel file. I know you were one of the best engineers we ever had. I know you were loyal to Vale Automotive even after we fired you, and I need to know why you stayed quiet for 10 years. Nolan laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think I stayed quiet? You didn't go to the media. You didn't contact NHTSA. You just fixed engines. I had a 6-month-old daughter and an NDA that would have bankrupted me if I violated it. You think I stayed quiet because I was loyal? Nolan shook his head. I stayed quiet because I was trapped. Because every time I thought about calling a reporter or filing a complaint, I thought about Elsie and what would happen if your company came after me. If I lost this shop. Lost custody because I couldn't provide for her. He picked up the top folder and held it out to Marin. But I never stopped documenting, never stopped keeping records, because I knew someday this would come out. The defect was too fundamental, the failure rate too predictable. It was always going to blow up. I just had to make sure that when it did, there was a record of who knew what and when they knew it. Marin took the folder. So you were building a case? I was protecting my daughter. The case was just insurance. Against what? Against men like Conrad Sloan deciding that the mechanic who used to work for them needed to be silenced. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Marin's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and something in her expression shifted. I have to go. I have a board meeting in the morning. They're voting on whether to file bankruptcy or try to negotiate a settlement with the plaintiffs. Which way will they vote? I don't know. Conrad's been pushing for bankruptcy. Says it's the only way to limit liability, protect the company assets. She paused. He's probably right. Nolan walked her to the door. Outside, a black Mercedes was parked in front of the garage. Engine running, driver waiting. The kind of car that cost more than Nolan made in 2 years. Can I take one of these folders? Marin asked. I want my legal team to see what you have. Take them all. I have copies. Of course you do. Nolan gathered the stack of folders and handed them to her. They were heavy. 10 years of evidence, hundreds of hours of documentation, proof of a failure that had been predicted and ignored and covered up. Mr. Pierce, Marin said as she reached the door, if this goes where I think it's going, if there's a criminal investigation, you're going to be subpoenaed. You know that, right? I figured. Your NDA won't protect you once you're under oath. Good. She studied him for a moment. You really don't want anything from this? No settlement? No compensation for what we did to your career? Nolan thought about the purple dinosaur drawing on his office wall. Thought about Elsie's mac and cheese waiting in the oven at home. Thought about 10 years of quiet, steady work in a 2-bay garage in a town where nobody cared what he used to be. I want Conrad Sloan to answer for what he did, Nolan said. I want the families who lost people to know it wasn't their fault. That it wasn't bad luck or bad driving or bad maintenance. I want them to know the truth. And if the truth destroys Vail Automotive, then maybe it should be destroyed. Marin nodded slowly. She walked to the Mercedes, the folders tucked under her arm, and paused with her hand on the door. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For what Conrad did to you. For what the company did. You weren't there. I'm there now. She got in the car and it pulled away, taillights disappearing down Oak Street toward the highway that would take her back to Detroit and boardrooms and the slow-motion collapse of an empire. Nolan stood in the doorway of his garage and watched her go. Then he locked up, turned off the lights, and drove the 6 blocks home to a small house where his daughter was waiting and the oven timer was beeping, and nothing at all had changed, except everything had. Bukchat. Elsie was at the kitchen table doing homework, or what passed for homework in 1st grade, which mostly seemed to involve coloring shapes and practicing writing her name. You're late, she said without looking up from her paper. Mac and cheese is crusty. Sorry, Bug. Had a customer come in right at closing. Mrs. Patterson's breaks again? Different customer. Nolan pulled the casserole dish from the oven. The top was indeed crusty. The cheese darkened around the edges. He scooped 2 servings onto plates and brought them to the table. Elsie looked at her plate critically. The brown parts taste burnt. The brown parts are the best parts. You always say that. Because it's always true. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Outside, the streetlight on the corner flickered on, casting long shadows across the front yard. Mr. Kowalski's sprinkler started up with its familiar clicking rhythm. Dad? Yeah? Maya Rodriguez's mom said you used to work for a big car company, before I was born. Nolan set down his fork. Maya Rodriguez's mom talks a lot. Is it true? Yeah, I worked for Vail Automotive, designed engines. Like the ones you fix now? Some of them. Elsie pushed her mac and cheese around her plate. Why'd you stop? How do you explain to a 6-year-old that you got fired for being right? That you were escorted out of a building by security while your colleagues avoided eye contact? That you spent the next year sending out resumes while your daughter's mother decided she didn't want to be married to an unemployed engineer with a newborn? It was time for something different, Nolan said. Sometimes jobs don't work out. Maya's mom said you got fired. Maya's mom really needs a hobby. Did you? Nolan looked at his daughter. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, too perceptive for someone who still believed in the tooth fairy. Yeah, he said. I got fired. Why? Because I told my boss something he didn't want to hear. What did you tell him? That he was making a mistake, that the engines we were building weren't safe. Elsie considered this. Were you right? Yeah. And he fired you for being right? Sometimes people don't like being told they're wrong, especially when they're the boss and being wrong is expensive. That's dumb, Nolan smiled. Yeah, Bug. It is. They finished dinner. Elsie went to brush her teeth while Nolan cleaned up the kitchen. He was loading the dishwasher when his phone rang. Unknown number, Detroit area code. He let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, it rang again. Same number. On the third call, he answered. Mr. Pierce? A woman's voice, professional, crackling slightly on what sounded like a car phone connection. This is Jessica Chen. I'm an attorney with Morrison & West. Marin Vale asked me to contact you. Kind of late for a legal call. I apologize. Ms. Vale just left an emergency board meeting and asked me to reach out immediately. We need to discuss your documentation of the VX7 failures. Nolan put the phone on speaker and continued loading dishes. Discuss what about them. We need to verify the chain of custody for your records. If these documents are going to be used in litigation, and they will be, we need to establish that they haven't been tampered with, that they're authentic contemporaneous records, and that you maintain them in the normal course of business. I kept them in a filing cabinet, took photos with whatever camera I had at the time, wrote notes on my breaks. That normal enough? Mr. Pierce, I understand this is inconvenient, but, lady, it's 8:30 on a Thursday night. I've got a first grader in the bathroom who needs to practice her spelling words and a cat that's about to knock over my coffee. So whatever you need to verify, we can do it tomorrow during business hours. There was a pause. Of course. I apologize. Can you come to our Detroit office tomorrow afternoon? No. Monday? I run a business, Ms. Chen. I can't just close up shop and drive to Detroit every time Vale Automotive needs something. We're prepared to compensate you for your time. I don't want compensation. I want to be left alone to do my job. Another pause, longer this time. Then, Mr. Pierce, I'm going to be direct with you. We have reason to believe that certain parties within Vale Automotive may attempt to discredit your testimony or interfere with your records. We need to get ahead of that. What certain parties? I'm not at liberty to say over an unsecured line. Nolan stopped loading dishes. You think someone's going to come after me? I think you have documentation that could result in criminal charges against powerful people who have significant resources and strong motivation to make that documentation disappear. So you want to take my records into protective custody? We want to make digital copies, verify their authenticity with forensic analysts, and yes, preserve the originals in a secure location. No. Mr. Pierce, those records stay with me. You want copies? Fine. Send someone here with a scanner, but I'm not handing over the only proof I have that I was right about this. Jessica Chen sighed. I'll talk to Ms. Vale. We'll send a team tomorrow morning if that works for you. Make it afternoon. I've got an oil change at 9 and a transmission at 11. Fine. 2 p.m.? Works. He hung up as Elsie emerged from the bathroom, toothbrush dangling from her mouth. Who off that? She mumbled around the toothbrush. Work stuff. Go spit. She trudged back to the bathroom. Nolan heard the water run, heard her humming something that was probably supposed to be the song from whatever cartoon she'd been watching. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. The soundtrack of a life he'd built from the rubble of the one that had collapsed 10 years ago. His phone buzzed. Text message from the unknown Detroit number. This is Marin Vale. Jessica said you won't let us secure the records. I understand your hesitation, but please reconsider. These documents are the only hard evidence we have. MV Nolan typed back, they're also the only hard evidence I have. If something happens to them while in your custody, I'm left with nothing. They stay here. The response came fast. Then let us station security at your shop. 24-hour protection until this is resolved. Don't need protection. Need people to leave me alone. Mr. Pierce, please. Conrad Sloan has been with this company for 30 years. He has connections, resources, and a very strong incentive to make sure your documentation never sees a courtroom. I'm not being paranoid. I'm being realistic. Nolan stared at the message. Elsie called from her bedroom that she was ready for a story. The cat, an orange tabby named Wrench, jumped onto the counter and started investigating the leftover mac and cheese. He typed, 1 security guard, outside only, and if anyone in a suit shows up at my daughter's school, this deal is off. Agreed. Thank you. He locked his phone and went to read Elsie a story about a mouse who lived in a department store and had adventures with the stuffed animals after closing time. She fell asleep halfway through chapter 3, her small body curled around her favorite stuffed elephant. Nolan sat in the chair next to her bed for a while after she was asleep, watching her breathe, listening to the house settle around them. 10 years ago, he'd held her in a hospital room and made a promise that he would keep her safe, that he would build a life for them, that he would never let the chaos of the world touch her. Now the chaos was parked outside in a Mercedes, hiding in filing cabinets, buried in engine blocks scattered across the Midwest. His phone buzzed one more time. Another text from Marin Vale. The board voted tonight. We're filing Chapter 11 on Monday. Conrad convinced them it's the only way to survive the lawsuits. I'm sorry. Nolan didn't respond. He turned off his phone, checked the locks on the doors and windows, and went to bed in a house that felt suddenly smaller, more fragile, like it was built from cards instead of boards and nails. Outside, a black SUV pulled up across the street and parked under the broken streetlight. The driver cut the engine, but didn't get out. Just sat there in the dark, watching. Security, probably. Or something else. Nolan closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind kept circling back to the filing cabinet in his office, to the folders stacked inside, to 10 years of careful documentation that had suddenly become the most dangerous thing he owned. Somewhere in Detroit, in a boardroom overlooking the river, Conrad Sloan was probably having a drink and making phone calls. Calculating. Planning. Protecting the empire he'd spent 3 decades building. And here in Grayford, in a small house on a quiet street, Nolan Pierce lay awake and waited for morning and whatever came with it. The mouse in Elsie's book had been brave enough to face the world outside the department store, had made friends with unlikely allies and found adventure in unexpected places. Nolan hoped like hell this story ended better than that one usually did, because mice, in his experience, tended to get crushed by things much bigger than themselves. And he had a feeling the crushing was about to begin. The security guard's name was Marcus Webb, and he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He showed up at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before Nolan usually opened the shop, and stood by the black SUV with the posture of a man who'd done too many overnight shifts and not enough stretching. Nolan unlocked the garage bay doors and nodded at him. Marcus nodded back. They didn't speak. It was the beginning of a relationship built entirely on mutual discomfort and contractual obligation. By 8:15, Nolan had the Malibu finished and was elbow-deep in a Ford F-150's transmission when the legal team arrived. 3 people in a silver Lexus. Jessica Chen, who looked exactly like her voice sounded. Crisp, efficient, 20 years of arguing in front of judges. A younger man in glasses who introduced himself as David Park, forensic document analyst. And a woman who didn't introduce herself at all, just started unloading equipment from the trunk. Mr. Pierce, Jessica said, extending a hand Nolan couldn't shake because his were covered in transmission fluid. Thank you for accommodating us. Didn't have much choice. You always have a choice. Nolan wiped his hands and led them to the office. David Park immediately zeroed in on the filing cabinet like a bloodhound catching a scent. The unnamed woman started setting up what looked like a portable scanning station on Nolan's desk, pushing aside the coffee mug Elsie had made him in art class. Lumpy, glazed in purple, perfect. "We'll need to photograph each document in situ before removal," David said, already pulling on white cotton gloves. "Then we'll scan at 600 dpi, create hash values for each file, and document the complete chain of custody." "In English," Nolan said. Jessica stepped in. "We're going to prove these documents are exactly what you say they are. Contemporaneous records created at the time of each repair, unaltered, authentic. That way, when we present them in court, opposing counsel can't claim they're fabricated or tampered with." "They're not fabricated." "I believe you. But belief doesn't hold up in federal court. Evidence does." They worked for 3 hours. David photographed every folder, every page, every handwritten note. The unnamed woman, who finally introduced herself as Rita Chen, Jessica's paralegal and also apparently her sister, scanned everything with a machine that hummed and beeped and spit out page after page of perfect digital copies. Nolan tried to work on the F-150, but he kept drifting back to the office doorway, watching strangers handle his records like archaeological artifacts, which, in a way, they were. 10 years of buried truth, carefully excavated. "Mr. Pierce, well," David called from the filing cabinet. "This notation here, Batch Vivex 7-2847-B, manufactured week 23, 2015. How did you obtain the batch codes?" "They're stamped on the engine block, right side below the cylinder head." "And you photographed each one? Every single engine that came through here?" David made a note on his tablet. "This is extraordinarily thorough documentation. Did you have legal training?" "Engineering training. Same thing, basically. Document everything, assume someone will question your work later." Good instinct. By noon, they were done. Rita had 4 external hard drives loaded with scanned files, each one encrypted and backed up to 3 separate cloud servers. David had a complete photographic record of the filing cabinet's contents, organized by date and cross-referenced with Nolan's repair invoices. Jessica gathered her team by the door. "We'll have preliminary forensic analysis by Monday. But Mr. Pierce, I want to be clear, these documents are going to change everything. They establish a clear pattern of ignored warnings, documented failures, and corporate knowledge of a lethal defect. That's the point. The point is also that you're now the star witness in what will likely be the largest automotive safety lawsuit in decades. Your life is about to get complicated." "It's already complicated. It's about to get more complicated." She wasn't wrong. The first news van showed up Tuesday morning. Local affiliate, young reporter with ambitious hair and questions Nolan had no intention of answering. Marcus Webb politely but firmly escorted her back to the property line. The second van arrived an hour later, then a third. By Wednesday, there were 6 news trucks parked on Oak Street, their satellite arrays telescoped up like mechanical flowers searching for signal. Nolan kept the garage doors closed and worked on cars. Marcus Webb earned his paycheck keeping reporters at bay. And somewhere in the background, just out of sight, the legal machinery ground forward. Thursday afternoon, Marin Vale came back. She looked worse than the first time. Hair pulled back but coming loose, suit jacket wrinkled like she'd slept in it, dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. She walked past Marcus with a brief nod that suggested they'd met before, maybe multiple times. Nolan was replacing brake pads on a Honda Civic when she appeared in the bay. "Bad week?" he asked without looking up. "You could say that." "Board still pushing bankruptcy?" "Board approved it. We filed Monday morning. Vale Automotive is officially in Chapter 11 reorganization." She said it like she was announcing a death in the family, which, in a way, she was. Nolan torqued the last lug nut and lowered the Civic off the lift. "Sorry. Are you?" "Your grandfather was good to me. Yeah, I'm sorry his company's falling apart. Even though it deserves to? Things can deserve to fail and still be worth mourning." Marin leaned against the workbench, suddenly looking exhausted. "The lawyers went through your documentation. David Park says it's some of the most comprehensive failure analysis he's ever seen outside of an NTSB investigation. I'm thorough." "You're angry." Nolan set down his wrench. Yeah, I'm angry. At us? At Conrad? At the whole situation? Yes. It wasn't the answer she expected, Nolan could tell. She'd been looking for something more specific, more actionable. A villain she could point to and blame. But the truth was messier than that. I'm angry you fired me for being right, Nolan said. I'm angry Conrad buried my reports. I'm angry every time I pulled apart another failed engine and knew it didn't have to be this way. And I'm angry at myself for staying quiet because I was scared. You had a daughter to protect. That's what I told myself. But the truth is I could have found a way. Could have contacted NHTSA anonymously, leaked the documents to a reporter, something. Instead, I just fixed engines and kept records and told myself I was playing the long game. He picked up a shop rag and wiped his hands, a gesture so automatic it barely registered. 10 years is a long game. People died in those 10 years. Families lost parents, kids, spouses, because engines failed the way I predicted they would, and I kept quiet. That's not your fault, isn't it? Marin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Conrad's blaming you. Nolan went still. What? Not publicly, not yet. But in internal meetings and conversations with the board, he's building a narrative that you sabotaged the VX7 design, that you were a disgruntled employee who deliberately created a defect so you could later profit from exposing it. That's insane. That's strategy. He's trying to discredit you before you can testify. He's pulling your personnel file, your performance reviews, your financial records from when you worked for us, looking for anything he can use to paint you as unstable, vindictive, compromised. Nolan felt something cold settle in his chest. He's going after my credibility. He's going after everything. Your employment history, your divorce, your finances. What about my finances? Marin looked uncomfortable. You filed bankruptcy in 2017, medical bills from Elsie's birth, your ex-wife's student loans. How do you know about that? Conrad's lawyers are building a profile. They're going to argue that you have financial motivation to fabricate evidence, that you're trying to cash in on Vale's crisis. I told you I don't want your money. I know, but Conrad's going to argue you're just playing hard to get, waiting for the settlement offers to get bigger. Nolan threw the shop rag across the bay. It hit the far wall and fell to the concrete with a pathetic slap. So what am I supposed to do? Just let him trash my reputation? You're supposed to let us handle it. Jessica has a forensic accountant reviewing your business records to establish you haven't received any suspicious payments. David's prepared to testify that your documentation is authentic. We're building a case that you're exactly what you appear to be, a mechanic who documented failures in the normal course of business. And what about the part where I used to work for you? Where I have every reason to be bitter? That's where it gets complicated. Marin straightened, and something in her posture changed. She wasn't the exhausted CEO anymore. She was someone who'd spent 3 days in strategy meetings with lawyers who billed $400 an hour. Jessica thinks we need to get ahead of Conrad's narrative. She wants to file a motion to compel Conrad's communications, every email, every memo, every conversation he had about the VX7 defect and about you. Will she get it? In discovery? Maybe. But it'll take months, and Conrad's lawyers will fight every step. So Jessica has another idea, which is, she wants you to sue us. Nolan stared at her. What? File a wrongful termination suit. Claim Vale Automotive fired you in retaliation for reporting safety defects. It would force the company to produce all internal communications about your termination, about the VX7 development, about everything Conrad did to bury your warnings. You want me to sue you to help you sue yourselves? I want you to sue Vale Automotive as it existed under Conrad Sloan's leadership. I want to draw a clear line between the company that ignored your warnings and the company I'm trying to build from what's left. Nolan walked to the bay door and looked out at Oak Street. The news vans were still there, idling, waiting. Marcus Webb was on his phone, probably reporting this conversation to whoever was actually paying his salary. And somewhere, in an office tower in Detroit, Conrad Sloan was spinning narratives and building defenses and doing everything he could to make sure the empire didn't fall on him. If I sue you, Nolan said slowly, Conrad will come at me with everything. He'll drag out every mistake I ever made, every bill I couldn't pay, every time you were human, Marin finished. Yes, he will. And we need to make sure you're ready for that. I don't know if I am. Mr. Pierce, Nolan, I know this isn't fair. I know you never asked to be the center of this, but you're the only person outside Vail Automotive who has contemporaneous documentation of what went wrong. You're the only one who can prove Conrad knew about the defect and buried it. Why does it have to be me? It was a question Nolan had been asking himself for 10 years, in different forms, in different contexts. Why did it have to be him who noticed the defect? Why did it have to be him who filed the reports? Why did it have to be him who got fired, who lost everything, who spent a decade fixing the same broken engines over and over? Marin didn't have an answer. Nobody did. Sometimes you were just the person standing in the right place or the wrong place when history decided to happen. I need to think about it, Nolan said finally. Take until tomorrow. After that, Conrad's going to file his motion to exclude your testimony. He's going to argue you're not a qualified expert, that your documentation is hearsay, that you have undisclosed financial interest in the outcome. Once he does that, the window for us to get ahead of the narrative closes. She handed him a business card, her personal cell number, written on the back in the same kind of precise handwriting Nolan used in his repair notes. Engineers, apparently, never lost certain habits. Call me tonight, either way. Then she was gone, back to the Mercedes, back to Detroit, back to the war that was being fought in conference rooms and courtrooms, while Nolan stood in a garage that smelled like brake fluid and old coffee. He worked until 6, then drove home. Elsie was at Mrs. Patterson's house, their standing Thursday arrangement, because Mrs. Patterson liked having someone to cook for, and Elsie liked Mrs. Patterson's cat. Nolan picked her up, and they drove home through streets that felt suddenly unfamiliar, like he was seeing them from the wrong angle. Dad, why are there cameras outside our house? Nolan looked. She was right. 2 news vans parked on the street, cameras pointed at the small house like it was a crime scene. Work stuff. What kind of work stuff needs cameras? Boring adult work stuff. Is it about the car company, the one you used to work for? Nolan pulled into the driveway and put the car in park. He should have known she'd figure it out. Elsie was 6, but she paid attention. She noticed things. It was one of the ways she was exactly like him. Yeah, he said. It's about the car company. Are you in trouble? No, but some people at the company are. Because of the engines you said were broken? Yeah. Elsie unbuckled her seatbelt and looked at him with those 2 perceptive eyes. Are they mad at you for being right? Some of them are. That's still dumb. Yeah, Bug. It is. They went inside. Nolan made spaghetti while Elsie did homework at the kitchen table. The news van stayed outside. Marcus Webb's replacement, a woman named Torres who looked like she could bench press the SUV she arrived in, parked across the street and settled in for the night shift. At 8:47, after Elsie was in bed, Nolan's phone rang. Unknown number, New York area code. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. Pierce? This is Richard Kelso. I'm a producer for Frontline. We're working on an investigation into Vail Automotive's safety practices, and we'd like to talk to you. I'm not interested. We've spoken with 3 families who lost loved ones in VX7 engine failures. They deserve to know the truth about what happened. You can help them understand. Call Vail's PR department. Mr. Pierce, we know you documented these failures for years. We know you tried to warn the company. Don't you think the public deserves to hear that story? The public can hear it in court. If it gets to court, Conrad Sloan has a reputation for making these things disappear. Settlements, NDAs, legal maneuvers that keep the truth buried. But if you go on record now... Nolan hung up. The phone rang again. Same number. He blocked it. 2 minutes later, a text from a different number. Mr. Pierce, this is Amanda Reeves, Washington Post. We're publishing a story on Vail Automotive next week. I'd like to include your perspective. Can we talk? Nolan turned off his phone. In the silence that followed, he could hear the house settling around him. The refrigerator's hum, the heat kicking on. Elsie's soft breathing from down the hall, audible through the crack in her door. He thought about Marin's offer, about suing Vale Automotive, about forcing Conrad's communications into the open, about becoming the public face of a corporate scandal that was about to consume everything. He thought about the news vans outside and the reporters calling and the forensic accountants digging through his finances looking for evidence of what? What did they think they'd find? He ran a two-bay garage in Ohio. His biggest monthly expense was Elsie's orthodontist savings fund. He thought about Conrad Sloan in a Detroit office tower, probably drinking expensive scotch and making plans. At 9:23, Nolan turned his phone back on and called the number Marin had written on the card. She answered on the first ring. "Did you decide? If I do this, if I sue, I need protection, real protection, not just Marcus Webb sitting outside my shop." "What kind of protection?" "Legal. I need your lawyers to represent me in the wrongful termination suit. I need them to shield my finances, my history, everything Conrad's going to try to use against me." "Done. And I need you to keep Elsie out of this. No cameras at her school, no reporters following her, nothing that touches her." "I can't control the media." "Then control your media people. Put out a statement that my daughter is off limits. Make it clear that anyone who approaches her will face legal action." There was a pause, then Marin said, "Okay, I'll talk to our communications team. And one more thing." "What?" "When this is over, when Conrad's dealt with and the truth comes out and Vale Automotive either survives or doesn't, I want my name back." "Your name?" "I designed the VX7 platform. Before Conrad pushed it into production, before the defect, before everything went wrong, I designed an engine that worked, an engine that would have been safe if it had been manufactured correctly. And I want credit for that, not for the failure, for the design that Conrad corrupted." Marin was quiet for a long moment. "I'll see what I can do." "That's not good enough. I want it in writing. Part of whatever settlement comes out of the wrongful termination suit. My name goes back on the VX7 patent, the original design, before Conrad's changes." That's not a simple ask. Patent attribution is complicated, and I don't care how complicated it is. That's the price. You want me to be your star witness? You want me to sue your company? You want me to stand up in court and destroy Conrad Sloan? Fine. But I get my name back. Another pause. Then, "I'll have Jessica drafted into the agreement." "Good. Nolan, thank you." "Don't thank me yet. This is going to get ugly." "I know." He hung up and sat in the dark kitchen for a while, listening to the house and trying to convince himself he'd made the right choice. Tomorrow, Jessica Chen would file a wrongful termination lawsuit, Nolan Pierce versus Vale Automotive Systems. And the clock would start ticking on whatever Conrad Sloan had planned. Nolan stood and checked the locks on the doors, checked the windows, checked Elsie's room where she slept curled around her elephant. Everything looked the same as it always did. But something had shifted. The world had tilted on its axis, and there was no going back to the way things were before Marin Vale walked into his garage with questions about defective engines. He went to bed but didn't sleep. Just lay there, listening to Torres's SUV idling outside, to the distant sound of someone's TV through the walls, to all the ordinary noises of an ordinary night that wasn't ordinary at all. And sometime around 3 a.m., his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You made a mistake, Pierce. You should have stayed quiet. No signature, no identifying information, just a threat delivered through encrypted text from someone who wanted him to know they were watching." Nolan got out of bed and looked out the window. Torres was still there in the SUV. The news vans were gone. Even reporters needed sleep. The street was empty except for shadows and streetlights and the ordinary darkness of a small Ohio town at night. But someone was out there, watching, waiting. He checked on Elsie again. Still sleeping, still safe, still blissfully unaware that her father had just painted a target on both their backs. Nolan went back to bed and stared at the ceiling until dawn crept through the windows and Friday morning arrived with all its implications. At 7:15, his phone rang. "Jessica Chen. We're filing in 1 hour. Are you ready?" No. Good. Nobody who's actually ready for this kind of fight ever wins. It's the scared ones who find out what they're made of. That's supposed to be inspiring? It's supposed to be true. Conrad's going to come at you hard. He's going to dig up everything, your bankruptcy, your divorce, every parking ticket and late payment and mistake you've ever made. He's going to try to make you look desperate, unstable, compromised. I know. And you need to let him. You need to stand there and take it and not flinch. Because every attack he makes, every bit of dirt he throws, it just proves he's desperate. It proves you're the threat he can't neutralize any other way. Nolan thought about that. About being the threat. About being the one person Conrad Sloan couldn't buy, or intimidate, or make disappear. File the suit, he said. Already done. I filed it at 7 a.m. It'll hit the docket in Detroit by noon, and by 1 p.m. every news outlet in the country will be running the story. Former Vail engineer sues company over retaliation for safety warnings. It's going to be everywhere. Great. Nolan, this is the right thing. Doesn't make it easier. No, but it makes it worth it. She hung up. Nolan made coffee, got Elsie up, and fed and off to school with Mrs. Patterson, then drove to the shop. Marcus Webb was back on duty, looking tired but alert. The news vans had returned, multiplied, metastasized. There were at least a dozen now, plus print reporters with notebooks and photographers with telephoto lenses. Nolan parked in the bay and closed the door behind him before any of them could get close enough to shout questions. He had 4 cars scheduled for the day. An oil change, a brake job, a diagnostic on a check engine light, and a transmission that was probably terminal. Ordinary work. Normal work. The kind of thing he'd been doing for 10 years. He started with the oil change and tried not to think about the lawsuit that was about to make his name national news. At 1:07 p.m., his phone exploded with notifications, news alerts, text messages, emails from addresses he didn't recognize. He ignored them all and focused on the brake job. At 2:34, a process server showed up with papers from Conrad Sloan's legal team, a motion to dismiss the wrongful termination suit, a countersuit for defamation and breach of NDA, and a subpoena for every document, every record, every piece of evidence Nolan had collected in the past 10 years. Marcus Webb signed for the papers and brought them to Nolan. "You expecting these?" Marcus asked. "Yeah." "You need anything?" Nolan looked at the stack of legal documents, then at the brake pads he was installing, then back at Marcus. "Coffee? Black? Strong enough to strip paint?" Marcus almost smiled. "I'll see what I can do." By the time Nolan finished the brake job, Jessica Chen had called 3 times. Marin Vale had texted twice, and someone claiming to be from the FBI had left a voicemail asking him to call back. He ignored them all and moved on to the diagnostic. The check engine light was a bad O2 sensor. Easy fix. He had it done in 40 minutes. The transmission was, as suspected, terminal. He called the customer and gave them the bad news. They asked if he could do anything. He said no, but he could recommend a good dealership for a replacement vehicle. They thanked him and hung up. Another ordinary transaction in an increasingly unordinary day. At 5:47, just as Nolan was cleaning up to go pick up Elsie, Marin Vale arrived again. She looked wired, running on coffee and adrenaline and whatever kept CEOs functional during corporate collapse. "Did you see the news?" she asked. "I've been working. It's everywhere. Every major outlet is running the story. Vail engineer claims retaliation for safety warnings. Conrad scrambling. He put out a statement calling you a disgruntled ex-employee with financial problems and a grudge." Sounds about right. "Nolan, this is serious. He's trying to destroy your credibility before you can testify." "I know. And you're just, what, changing oil and replacing brake pads? What else am I supposed to do?" Marin stared at him like he was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Most people would be panicking, calling lawyers, strategizing, preparing for the fight. "I've been preparing for this fight for 10 years. Another day of brake pads isn't going to change anything." She sat on the workbench, suddenly looking exhausted again. "Conrad's board allies are calling for my resignation. They're saying I'm mishandling the crisis, that I'm making it worse by supporting your lawsuit." Are you going to resign? No. Good. They sat in silence for a moment. Two people who'd been pulled into a collision neither of them wanted, but both were too stubborn to walk away from. Jessica says Conrad's going to depose you next week, Marin said. His lawyers will ask you about everything, your employment, your finances, your relationship with me, every detail of how you collected your evidence. Let them ask. They're going to try to trip you up, get you to contradict yourself, admit to something that makes you look biased or compromised. I'll tell the truth, same as I've been doing. Truth isn't always enough, not in court, not when the other side has better lawyers and deeper pockets and a willingness to lie. Nolan stood and started putting away tools. You know what I learned in 10 years of running this shop? Engines don't lie. You can spin narratives and build arguments and hire fancy lawyers, but at the end of the day, metal either holds or it breaks. The VX7 engines broke. They broke exactly the way I said they would, and no amount of Conrad's legal maneuvering changes that. I hope you're right. I am, because I did the math. Marin left. Nolan locked up the shop, waved to Marcus Webb, and drove home through streets lined with news vans and curious neighbors and the weight of a decision that was already shaping into consequences. Elsie was waiting at Mrs. Patterson's, full of stories about art class and recess and a kid named Tyler who'd fallen off the monkey bars. Normal 6-year-old concerns. The world as it should be. They went home and made tacos and watched a nature documentary about emperor penguins. Elsie fell asleep on the couch halfway through. Nolan carried her to bed, tucked her in, kissed her forehead. Then he sat at the kitchen table and read through the papers Marcus had delivered. Conrad's motion to dismiss, his countersuit, the subpoena. It was all there in legal language. The accusation that Nolan had fabricated evidence, that he was motivated by financial gain, that his documentation was unreliable and his testimony worthless. Nolan made notes in the margins, factual errors, provable lies, accusations that didn't match the timeline. By midnight, he had a 3-page response drafted in the same precise handwriting he used for repair notes. He emailed it to Jessica Chen with a subject line that just said, "Corrections." Her response came back in 4 minutes. "Are you always this thorough?" Nolan typed, "I'm an engineer. Thoroughness is the job. Conrad's going to hate you. He already does. Good. That means you're winning." Nolan closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the house settle and Torres's SUV idling and the ordinary sounds of a life that had become extraordinary without his permission. Tomorrow was Saturday. He had 6 cars scheduled, a backlog of work that wouldn't care about lawsuits or depositions or the corporate warfare happening in Detroit. And somewhere, in an office tower overlooking a river, Conrad Sloan was making plans. But so was Nolan Pierce, and he'd had 10 years to get his plans exactly right. The deposition was scheduled for Tuesday at 9 a.m. in a conference room that probably cost more per hour than Nolan made in a week. Jessica Chen picked him up at 7. She didn't trust him to drive to Detroit on his own, which was fair because Nolan had seriously considered not showing up at all. "Wear the blue shirt," she'd told him on the phone. "Not the one with the grease stain, the other blue one. I only have one blue shirt." Then buy another one. He'd bought another one. It felt stiff and wrong, like he was wearing someone else's skin. They drove in silence for the first hour. Jessica kept glancing at the notes on her tablet, then at Nolan, then back at the notes. Finally, she said, "Conrad's lead attorney is Martin Vickers. He's been doing corporate defense for 30 years. He's good at making witnesses look stupid." "I'll try not to be stupid. That's not what I mean. He's going to ask you the same question 5 different ways, trying to get you to contradict yourself. He's going to imply things without stating them directly. He's going to make you angry, so you say something you regret." "I don't get angry." Jessica looked at him. "Everyone gets angry. Not in a way that shows." They pulled into the parking garage of a glass tower that reflected the gray Detroit sky like a mirror. The building directory listed Vail Automotive Systems on floors 12 through 18. Conrad's lawyers were on 23. The conference room had windows that looked out over the river and furniture that was aggressively expensive in that way, designed to intimidate. Martin Vickers was already there, along with 2 associates who looked fresh out of law school and hungry to prove something. A court reporter sat in the corner, fingers poised over the stenotype machine. Conrad Sloan sat at the far end of the table. He was older than Nolan remembered,